Okay, good evening, everybody. I want to thank the Johnson County beekeepers for virtually hosting us tonight. This is kind of a different webinar that we're going to be conducting because it's more like a little mini symposium on this very important topic of the relabeling of pesticides. And so this is something that is ongoing in the regulatory side of things, of how pesticides are labeled and the different restrictions that they're used to apply the pesticides in different settings, specifically as it relates to pollinators and particularly honeybees. And so we have two excellent guest speakers this evening. One is Wayne Bueller, who's here at NC State University in the horticulture department, and he has a fantastic website dealing with pollinator protection when it comes to pesticides. So he's going to start off by giving us a brief and fairly broad overview of the importance of pollinators and the interface that they have with pesticides. And then we also have Pat Jones from the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services in their pesticide division, who is part of that regulatory team where he's spearheading how these changes are going to come down from the EPA and how they're going to be implemented here at the local level in North Carolina. And I should mention that all of these issues are ever evolving and always changing. And so, you know, things are constantly going back and forth, and nothing is totally set in stone. So this is very much of an update of where we are now and where we foresee things going. But I think it's really important to have this conversation as beekeepers so that we can stay apprised of these ever-changing nuances when it comes to pesticide labels. So I want to first introduce Dr. Wayne Bueller, who will be presenting on behalf of Cooperative Extension when it comes to this Be Aware initiative. So go ahead, Wayne.
David, thank you very much. And I hope everybody can hear me loud and clear from the basement of Kilgore Hall here on the campus of NC State. I'm actually, as far as distances, maybe only 25 yards or more from where David is, speaking to you from my office. I'm probably better suited for doing this kind of presentation on the road or in front of a lot of folks, but I can say that this is a new type of technology for me, and I'm excited about participating in it with all of you. I work as the Pesticide Safety Education Specialist, and essentially what that means is I provide materials for private applicators who are most of our growers in the state, and commercial pesticide applicators who are people like landscapers, right-of-way maintainers, even structural pest control operators. So my work is really quite diverse. I have to keep up with many different issues, whether it's pesticide spills to pesticide storage to calibrating sprayers, recognizing the human health hazards of pesticides, as well as this competency area, one that is near and dear to my heart with beekeeping experience as a graduate student, on being aware of off-target effects, especially as it affects honeybees and other pollinators. So what I'm going to do tonight is just present to you one of the programs that I've developed, and as you can see on this slide, I had some help. This is also in conjunction with one of our pesticide county coordinators in Haywood County, Dr. Bill Skelton. Bill is also an avid beekeeper and is doing a great job in providing input for beekeepers as well as growers in his area about this crisis that we're seemingly experiencing. I also do quite a bit of work as it involves the aspect of giving materials to agents, and then the agents work pretty much as my mouth speaks. So what I'm doing here is showing a presentation that will be shown or has been shown to many of our pesticide applicators, private applicators, those being farmers, greenhouse operators, perhaps nursery managers, ranchers, and even some beekeepers. Beekeepers would be considered private applicators if they were to become certified for the use of restricted use pesticides. And in fact, many of you perhaps are private applicators because of the need of certain varroasides. In particular, checkmate was one that was used quite commonly many years ago. So David had said that I can put to use this polling feature of collaborate, and here's the test. If this works, David, I had to put you to the test too, but is it possible that we could see by a raise of hands, flashing hands on the screen? So it's not the raise of hands. What it is in the participants window, there's a couple icons. One on the left shows the smiley faces and those kind of things. The one on the furthest right is responding to the poll. So you can vote a yes or a no if you see those. Okay, so the question is, are you a North Carolina private pesticide applicator? There we go. So for those of you, just go ahead. I'll let some people vote the yes and no. Now again, for those of you that are in a club, maybe what would be, since you only get one vote as part of this webinar, maybe what you can do is take a show of hands and then type in the number or the percentage of those of you that are in the audience and the number of private pesticide applicators. So we have several people voting here. Go ahead and give a little bit, and then great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to publish it to the whiteboard. Okay, so there you go, Wayne. There's your results to the poll. All right. Hey, it's good to see that it works. Thanks, David. That was fun. And I wish I had a lot more questions like that because it'd be a lot more fun to interact with you folks. But here goes. I only have a little bit of time on the program. So I'm just going to show you this presentation. But please keep in mind that this is geared towards farmers. And I think that there's a lot of information that you will see that's very common knowledge to you as beekeepers. And maybe some new information that might be new from the standpoint of what pesticide applicators need to know, or the situation that they face with using products in vicinity of beehives. So let's go ahead and progress to this first, or through the title slide, and here we go. So this is basically my outline for the talk, addressing, again, to our growers the importance of pollinators and how they as applicators can help protect them, how pesticides can be used to control pests with minimal risks, we think, to pollinators, and the potential effects of treating crops during a flowering period and adjacent blooming crops and plants. So all of these are important issues. I think from an introductory standpoint, this is old hat, and I'm not telling you anything new as a beekeeper, but you recognize that pollinators are everywhere and needed everywhere. One of the things that I didn't know is just the importance of them in terms of providing foodstuffs for our wildlife, for contributing to the flowering plants that we can easily take for granted. 80% of all flowering plants require animal pollinators of some sort. In this case, for fruit and seed production needed for the survival of flowering plants in our environment, and also for food for our wildlife. The importance of pollinators to humans is difficult to calculate, but what we do know agriculturally is that it's essential for the production of more than 90 crops grown in the United States. And this is an interesting statistic. I don't know how we can prove it, but supposedly 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat, unless you're a teenager, daily can be attributed to pollinators. I guess this gets away from the chips and cookies type of diet. But 1 out of 3 bites, pretty significant. At least 30 to 40% of our food is dependent upon pollinators for it to be available to us at the grocery store. Here's a real interesting and telling visual. I remember seeing this after the crisis that we sustained with colony collapse disorder. It was published in the Scientific American Journal in April of 2009. And on the left frame, you see what breakfast may look like to some of you. I don't eat that nice of a breakfast. I wish I could in the mornings. But here we have, of course, juices and fruits, nuts, berries, jam, eggs, and coffee. And if you go to the right screen, you'll see what your breakfast might look like without bees. Rather plain, right? We still have the eggs, the toast, and maybe some butter, but we lose out on the jam and jellies, and certainly the fruit in terms of drinks and edible fruit is gone. You know, I had an interesting discussion with one of my colleagues who said, you know, I didn't realize that on the right side the coffee is black. On the left it has creamer. And so I had to explain to him that, yes, even the cream that we get from cows is because they have been fed with alfalfa. Alfalfa, of course, is a major crop in dairy production areas, or at least it's fed to many dairy cows to help enhance milk production. So thereby, without bees, we wouldn't even have abundance in dairy products like milk. Here's what a grocery store might look like without bees. So if you like eating a lot of starch, perhaps grains, and some of the crops that are not requiring pollination, this is probably what your diet may look like. When we look at pollinators in general, obviously, as you know, there's far more than honeybees. Honeybees have certainly carried the sign here before as the major pollinators of our food crops, but certainly others are critical. Bumblebees and blueberry bees, butterflies, beetles, flies, even wasps, as this picture detects, can have an impact on pollination. And in fact, I just read an article, I think it was last week, that a butterfly is the major pollinator of a type of azalea. I thought that was pretty interesting, but it didn't have enough hairs, obviously, to carry pollen from plant to plant, but just its fluttering wings was enough to enhance or have pollination occur in these azalea flowers. So again, this process of visiting flower to flower is called foraging. That's available, or that's a term that's used on many pesticide labels. And it goes without saying that the honeybee, the European honeybee, of course, is our champion food crop pollinator. In this case here, a picture taken from Maine shows how honeybees are trucked in many cases across country, to go to these areas where pollination by honeybees is a requirement. One such example of that is with almonds. And this is a fascinating story because about 80% of the almonds that are produced in the world come from Central California. And from what I've understood from beekeepers that I've met at meetings, almost half of all of the colonies in the United States of those that are commercial beekeeper kept colonies are in California at the time of the bloom of these crops, of these plants, trees. And so the honeybee serves a vital role here in pollination for all of our almonds, and requires something around 1.5 colonies for pollination. Most of our pollinators, the honeybees that are present there, are trucked there in January and then leave just as soon as the flowers have desist and take off to other areas where there is bloom, because there is nothing else in this area of California apparently outside of the almond trees. Here closer to home, where blueberries are grown, we have requirement of honeybees for pollination. 90% of the pollination of this crop is done by honeybees. And when you look at other crops that are commonly grown in North Carolina, from the apples in the mountains to raspberries, blackberries, peaches, everything in between, we see that honeybees serve a vital role, if not the prevalent pollinator, or if not the crop is dependent upon honeybees, at least they're somewhat dependent on pollination for the production of a well-shaped fruit. In this case, the example, as you see with cucumber, lack of good pollination by honeybees would cause the misshapen fruit or cucumber that you see in the top of the screen. So they serve a critical role not only as pollinators, main pollinators, but also as pollinators of crops that are required for them to fruit out or fully develop. This goes without saying for all of you that have been hit hard over the years, and I of course mentioned colony collapse disorder since 2007 and 8, but obviously we've seen some years where we've had a little bit of rebound other years, perhaps even this one, where it's been very costly to you as the beekeeper. 23% of an overwintering loss is certainly not unusual. In fact, the numbers are certainly probably higher than that on average, maybe over the last 3 to 4 years. The reason being, at least as it may be impacting honeybees, is complex and unknown. There are many factors that can be involved, and it appears that these factors can contribute partially and maybe in large part to pollinator losses. This slide depicts that kind of complexion, if you will, or interaction of these factors. Everything from poor nutrition, pesticides, even those that are used in hive for things like mite parasites, as the varroa is seen on the right there, nosema, gut pathogens, and viruses, many of which are known to be transmitted by varroa. So as you can see, it's been difficult to put a finger on just one, and it's probably not just one. It's more likely a combination of many of these factors, and it's highly uncertain as to what we can pinpoint. And as you can imagine, though, pollinators are highly sensitive to many pesticides. Honeybees are certainly very susceptible to nearly all insecticides, some that they can ward off better than others, but they are susceptible as a species to many of the pesticides that we use. Here is Varroa destructor. The name kind of says it all in terms of bees. They're the Dracula, if you will, of honeybees, feeding on both the adults, as you see pictured, in brood, and many of you, I'm sure, are dismayed to see these in your colonies. Certainly a major problem in terms of the direct feeding, as well as perhaps indirect on the spread of viruses or other pathogens within the hive. And it's hard to even put a finger on the number or the impact that varroa has had, but certainly it's very significant. So what can pesticide applicators do, or what can happen in terms of their impact of pesticide use? A lot of this is just a matter of understanding how the pesticide can harm honeybees and recognizing in the use of pesticides in conjunction with foraging habits is something that we want to make sure our growers are aware of. The label is really the focus of our webinar today, but in essence, there's things that are changing there, and it sometimes makes the label difficult to comprehend, even specialists, and I'm sure Pat would be willing to confess that it's hard to know exactly what is meant by some labeling statements, or the need to have more fine-tuning on labeling statements. We are big proponents of the use of IPM. As I tell my audiences, I am not endorsing pesticides, but endorsing the use of integrated pest management and the proper use of pesticides within the context of integrated pest management. And we certainly do a lot of training on that for our growers. And then, of course, there's some best management practices that they need to follow or be aware of in order to avoid the potential problems that pesticides have or represent for bees. Most pesticides aren't toxic to honeybees and other pollinators, and that's a good thing. As a general rule, insecticides tend to be more toxic to pollinators than fungicides and herbicides. And not all insecticides are toxic to pollinators, but there are many that are certainly lethal. in low concentrations. The poisoning of a honeybee can happen through these three routes: direct exposure, perhaps during application, residues that are picked up through foraging, and obviously a bee brings back a lot of things in visiting flowers as far as 3 or so miles away from a hive. And obviously those are shared with their sisters and some brothers in the hive as well. Residues from non-crop plants are significant, especially for misapplications or drift that may occur along field edges or ditches, or perhaps to ground cover that's pollinating. And these residues can have an effect in many ways. One that's significant to know about is through residual toxicity or extended residual toxicity. In this case, the pesticide remains toxic to the bees after the application is made, and the bee comes in contact with residues on the treated plant, including the bloom, that being the pollen and nectar, and can bring these residues back to cause problems with what we call extended residual toxicity. And that's further defined here. The compounds, especially some insecticides that remain toxic to bees for an extended period following applications, are referred to as those that are producing extended residual toxicity. And these pesticides should not, certainly by labeling statements, be applied to blooming crops or weeds. This is where we tend to find majority of problems, I think, with pesticide applications. So we're looking here at trying to help our growers be familiar with which of these products have the potential for extended residual toxicity. It's very difficult to state all of them without mentioning in generalities, perhaps that these are families that can be culpable or perhaps create the biggest number of problems. Organophosphates are ones that have been around for many years, and carbamates as well. The ones in particular that we hear a lot of, and certainly I'm sure you're aware of through the news, are the neonicotinoids, more easily stated as neonics. And these are represented by products that are used almost in every crop these days. It's become a very successful insecticide on a wide range of insect pests. And then there are the pyrethroids, some of which have probably been used in the hive, but in this case, for protection of bees, there may be some of these that are analogs for varroa control, but these have also been used agriculturally as well as around the landscape. Again, the bottom line for our growers is to rely on information from that label and make sure that they read the label and determine if that pesticide does leave residues that may be toxic to bees. What does that mean in terms of a honeybee's life? And you've heard the movie Bug's Life. This is a honeybee's life. I like this depiction. It's actually come to me by way of a bee specialist at the University of Minnesota, Marla Spivak. If you have a chance to listen to TED Talks, if you go to TED.com, you can search for Marla Spivak, S-P-I-V-A-K, and listen to some of her talks. She does a great job of giving very compelling presentations about honeybees and the need to protect them. So I think as a beekeeper you would enjoy them thoroughly. So what this graphic depicts is the activity of a bee foraging and starting its day at sunup and going through to sundown. So you can see as the number of sorties or flights from the hive increases, you've got that little bit of bump that's kind of skewed. In many ways, to be perhaps more precise, it's probably more bimodal, as you and beekeepers would certainly know better than I, but you probably see activities in early morning and maybe a crusting before noon, and then perhaps another crust that would occur in the afternoon. So this in general represents the bee's life that we would want a grower to know about. And then what we've done here is to kind of impose areas that it might be appropriate to use pesticides. This looks at the best time, but I could simply state that the worst time of day to apply any bee toxic pesticides would be from late morning through early afternoon. But there are products that can be used if they're applied from dusk here. Might be the best time, especially if there's little residue that's left. And if no residue is going to be left, the very early mornings might be an appropriate time. Again, I think this is a more favorable scenario, especially for those products that are just short-lived. If a grower can get out his spray rig and apply pesticides in the late afternoon, early evening, we usually find that the residues have dried, and that can be done in crops even that are in bloom, as long as there's no extended residual toxicity present or by a feature of that pesticide. So that gives them an idea of timing and the critical aspect of timing depending on the product that they're using. Obviously, bloom is the critical consideration, and that's what's going to be attractive to bees. So if there's anything blooming, you know that a bee is going to be near. So if crops or ground cover are in bloom, certainly the thing to do is to consider using pesticides that have a short activity period. In other words, they're non-extended residual toxic, and preferably apply them between late evening and early morning. The bottom line, do not apply pesticides that have an extended residual toxicity during bloom. The label is certainly the document that we all live by in terms of pesticide application. And as Pat will show you, there's a lot of language, a lot of new wording, verbiage that's been applied to pesticide labels by law just in the last 2 years. But in this case, these statements will instruct you to check the status of the application site for presence of blooming plants and pollinators. That's certainly the potential dangerous mix. We want to eliminate the exposure of bees and other pollinators when they're foraging on pollinator attractive plants at the application site. And obviously they want to evaluate and consider this before scheduling any pesticide application. This is what's commonly called the bee advisory box. And for the last year, we've seen this on pesticides in, as I mentioned, the neonicotinoids or neonic family of pesticides because of the concern that neonics are having on bees around the world. And so we now have labeling that shows in this form the protection of pollinators as being an emphasis on products, especially those from the neonic family. And this is beginning to become more popular or common to see. Again, Pat will allude to that in his presentation next. Pollinator protection statement should inform you of pesticide selection and, importantly here, the proper timing of that pesticide application. Take time, uninterrupted and undisturbed, to read and understand the label. And again, there's just not enough time for us to focus on reading the label, it seems, because there's always an urgent crisis to face. But this is something that growers are needing more and more to do. Products are becoming more specialized, and with that specialization becomes more information that they need to know on labels. And obviously they are responsible for their actions in protecting bees during the application and afterwards. The key questions, of course, is what's the growth cycle of the crop? When will it be in bloom? What are the dates that pests will need to be treated? What else is blooming in or near the field in terms of cover crops, weeds, fence row vegetations, adjacent crops? What pollinator activity is nearby? And can non-crop blossoms be removed by mowing or other methods before applying these types of pesticides? Certainly that's something that is useful on the floors of orchards and Christmas trees, just to be wary of the weeds that are present that might be attractive to bees and the potential of residues to accumulate on those flowers. And so by just going through that field and cutting or mowing these weeds, it can remove a great amount of risk to beekeepers or the bees that would be foraging in those fields. Knowing the landscape is critical. This is kind of a depiction of what North Carolina landscapes may look like, and certainly we have a diverse amount of crops here. But what we want to do is to make sure you're aware of your neighbors, observing the surroundings, recognizing that there might be areas nearby that have flowers in bloom, recognizing that fields bloom at different periods. So just to be cognizant of that is critical for our growers. And also to remember that IPM includes far more than just chemicals. And so our point here is to remember that they have many tools in their toolbox. And obviously we want them to employ a variety of tools, not just for the standpoint of non-target effects, but it certainly makes good sense from the standpoint of economics and potential for reducing other problems such as resistance. And therefore, using pesticides only when needed is the mantra of IPM, and we need to determine that need through regular scouting or monitoring of crops. Obviously, when using pesticides, we want to prevent drift for many reasons. One amongst is to prevent contamination of crops that may be in bloom, and therefore having visitations by honeybees. Towards the end here, we certainly want to focus on the need, and I think you all would agree with this, the need for cooperation and communication with beekeepers. So if we're going to reverse the tables here, we'll say this is a need for beekeepers to talk with growers and make sure that you're sharing your contact information with them. Maintaining this open dialogue before problems exist are going to be critical, I think, in the long run. And we want to encourage our growers to be aware of beekeepers in the area, to build this consensus, and to recognize that the beekeepers are critical. We're not only helping ourselves agriculturally, but our diets and the environment and the ecology by helping all of our beekeepers, including you folks that are even those with maybe 2 or 3 hives in the backyard. So we certainly want to see that communication is enhanced and that it can go a long way in preventing problems from occurring. A lot of growers have options that they can use, and I think through recognizing that bees are nearby, they can work with beekeepers, and beekeepers work with growers to help select products that are certainly less hazardous to our pollinators. That's the end of the presentation. This is just a kind of fun way to present the bearded group. These are our friends from Minnesota in the bee lab there. Probably many of you do this at fairs. Certainly very attractive for the kids or everybody to realize the beauty of bee beards. And then I give credit here to the folks that have helped with this presentation. My colleagues at Penn State have helped develop some programming that has been very good. I've worked closely with the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign from San Francisco, and they are producing training modules that have videos as well as worksheets and workbooks for our pesticide applicators. A lot of the photos, as I mentioned, and text come from Marla Spivak. And I want to point you lastly to a website. I think David mentioned this. It's one that I think would be helpful for you to recognize that we are trying to communicate this information to pesticide applicators. The name of the website is Pesticide Environmental Stewardship website, and it's a simple URL, pesticidestewardship.org. Within this site we have a lot of topics that are covered, one of which is pollinator protection. So as you'll see in this next slide, I just took a screen capture of the homepage for pesticidestewardship.org, and wanted to kind of give you an idea of the breadth of topics that we cover, everything from how to read pesticide labels to calibrating sprayers and spreaders of different kinds. But obviously the topic of interest here is pollinator protection. So I welcome you to take a look at this site. My name is all over this site and my email address, so I would be very happy to hear back from you if you have any comments, any input, any additional things that you feel would be of value to our pesticide applicators that visit this site and get again, a very general understanding of the importance they have as stewards of pesticides in protecting our pollinators. So, David, I think that was my half-hour plus a few minutes, but I think that would be the end of my talk.
Yeah, no, and that was really fantastic, and I totally and utterly underscore the value of that pollinator protection kind of sub-pages that you have on this site. It really is an excellent resource. It's my first place that I go to in any of these kind of issues. And so I just encourage everybody to find that site and bookmark it because it really is important. And there's going to be a lot of changes, coming about in the next couple of years. And so I think it's really incumbent on all of us to be privy to that information and to stay on top of it. So thank you so much, Wayne.
Yeah, thank you.
That was a fantastic presentation. Does anybody have any questions for Wayne at this point in time? Again, that was a broad overview of the interface between pollinators and honeybees and pesticides. And before we get into the specifics of the new label changes from the regulatory side with Pat Jones. So any questions, comments, or concerns with Wayne's presentation? Well, it's very possible that you guys are, you're preaching to the choir here too, Wayne. So there's one question here about the residual times. And again, Pat will probably address this in his talk. But there are those important aspects of these different pesticides that make them, relatively toxic or less toxic to non-targets. So are the residual times in the post-application interval part of the label on most of these insecticides?
Yeah, and Pat may be the better person to answer that question because I have not reviewed many of the latest labels. I do know that the RTs, or residual times, are something that EPA has taken a much closer look at. They do have a number of resources. One in particular is a table, and actually this is within the Pesticide Stewardship.org website. If you go to the resources that are presented at the end of the pollinator protection module, you'll find that this table is just pretty exhaustive of all of the residual time to 25% bee mortality. So all of the data is actually presented in this file. The labels, again, we're trying to make this in a way which a grower can appreciate. We don't want to get into too much of the technical aspects of these so-called RT25, but it will mention that this product should not be applied and allow access to blooming crops for a certain period of time. So it is indicated in labels. It may not be listed as an extended residual toxicity, but they may use terms such as do not apply this product if the period of the bee foraging is less than 48 hours from application. So it is addressed, and typically it's quantified. But Pat, you may know more from your hand or finger on the pulse of what's going on with labeling.
Yeah, Wayne, you're right. You will see effects of the RT25 value on the label as far as different verbiage. as far as restrictions to bees, do not allow drift to blooming crops or blooming weeds on the ground cover. You won't see that RT25 value published on the labels much. Like I say, it's in other resources that you can look up. But hopefully it will be added to labels more in the future to give growers a chance to compare products, like products, and to look at the RT25 values, on the label.
So that's yet another great reason of bookmarking this web page, so that you can, it's kind of a one-stop shopping of being able to find some of those values if they're not explicitly on the label. So that's really good. There's another question from the Durham County Club, wondering how different pesticides accumulate and get absorbed in the hive matrix and the wax. And obviously, we know that many of them do, but maybe if you just want to address that very quickly.
Yeah, that's true, David. I think you kind of said the mouthful there. Many of them do, and many of our products are lipophilic. They do love to go to areas that are rich in oils and wax, and wax by its very nature accumulates most anything like a sponge. And so since these products are lipophilic or fat-loving, it's likely that if they do get into the hive, that they'll show up in wax. Now, you could say that if you took a hunk of wax out of a hive and analyzed it, as some researchers have done, you can find upwards of 165 or maybe 169 pesticide active ingredients. So, yeah, they're there. But the key is, are they there in an effective dose? Are they there in having an impact? And I believe the answer that we can say with a high degree of certainty is that their impact, especially in the wax, is low, if of anything, simply because they simply stay there. And so I don't know how to address it from the standpoint of comb that can be used as a product that you might sell. In that case, there may be some concern with human consumption. But again, I feel like these pesticides, many of which are applied intentionally into the hive, such as we've had to deal with varroicides over the last 20 plus years, are they're going to be administered in the hive, and they're going to show up in other areas of the hive. The key is,
actually brings up
maintain.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the key is just to look at those labels and make the applications, and for using strips or any types of applicators in the hive, make sure you're aware of those times. And there's a limitation as to when you can put them in and how long you can leave them in the hive for that very reason.
And that really underscores the importance of comb rotation, something as part of beekeeping IPM, best management practices, and trying to rotate at least every 5 years, if not every 2 years, to swap out that old, darkened comb and always be replacing with newer comb, and it's for that reason and several others. And another question that came up from that same thing is that these chemical residuals possibly show up in human products like lip balms and soaps and things like that. And the answer is absolutely it does. And so those cosmetic companies either scrub the beeswax very, very thoroughly, or in the case of Burst Bees, for example, they just don't buy any beeswax in North America. They get all of their wax from Africa, where they don't have these residual chemicals. So it really is obviously an important issue. So if there are no other questions for Wayne, then just in the interest of time, I suggest that we let Pat go ahead and take over and now start to talk about some of the real specifics. And now that Wayne's kind of gotten us up to speed about kind of where we're at, Pat can give us that regulatory perspective of how the new changes that are going to be implemented and how bees and pollinators are really taking a prominent role in the new labels and how the language and the very specific changes are going to be implemented here in North Carolina. So Pat, go right ahead.
Okay. All right. As Dave and Wayne mentioned, I am with the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. I am in the Structural Pest Control and Pesticides Division. We are what is referred to as a state lead agency. Every state in the U.S. has a lead agency that is in charge of pesticide enforcement across the nation. All these states rely on EPA for the registration, the data collection, the approval of sites for the pesticides to be used on, and the use directions. But the state lead agencies, we have primacy over use in the state. Our regulations, if we have regulations, must be more stringent than EPA's. We have many that are, such as drift laws. We have storage regulations that are more stringent, use restrictions on fumigation equipment, and the like. But I have spent 30-some years in pesticide enforcement. Wayne is definitely the professional educator of the group. I am not. I am more used in talking to small counties and beekeepers. This is very different because we don't get to interact a lot, so it's a little different. We have been talking about the pesticide labels since the spring state bee meeting that we had in Monroe. I've visited about 11 or 12 counties so far going through this presentation. I have shortened it up a little bit for this evening. And we have been gathering beekeepers' responses to our survey at these meetings. We won't get to do that tonight, but I'll have a website later that you can go to and fill out the beekeeper survey that we've had posted since spring, where we try to get your responses and what you think would work for a state pollinator protection plan in North Carolina. And I'll explain a little bit of that as we go along. Of course, everybody has heard about the bees of late. There's a lot more interest in bees over the last several years, and I am seeing this as I go to the county meetings. Years ago, we would have 15 or 20 members maybe at some of the county meetings, but now the average is probably in around 40 or 50. So there has been a lot more interest in bees and pollinators in the last few years, especially with the colony collapse and the interest of the pesticides and pesticide residues. Wayne mentioned this slide a little bit earlier. This is what we call the bee advisory box that EPA came out with in the fall of 2013. And also the label language that we'll talk about later came out at that same time as EPA sent a letter to registrants to change their label language. I have updated these slides since EPA sent out their document last week on their proposal to mitigate exposure to bees from acutely toxic pesticide products. And I do have those changes in, and we'll talk about those as they show up. This information is covered on these slides here, and this is advisory. This is not enforcement label language, as we call it in our world. It is just good to know information that informs the grower on the product. It talks about application restrictions exist for this product. Tells them to look for this bee icon in the use directions, where we do have more stringent directions and things that they must follow at the use direction. It tells them that this product can kill bees and other pollinators, especially while they forage on plants, or if those residues end up on flowers or in the pollen of the plants. It does say that bees are present during foraging a lot, and this label makes it clear that pesticides cannot be applied to most of these products since all petals have fallen off, and also cannot be applied when the weeds are maybe blooming in the ground cover. This is the second part, continuation of the advisory box. tells that bees and other pollinators can be exposed to this pesticide, whether from direct contact or drift from the product to the hive and also to the blooming plants. It tells the grower to, when using this product, take steps to minimize exposure of this product to bees and to minimize the drift of this product to the hives or off-site habitat.
So Pat, very quickly, these are suggestions, right? It's just for advice. These are not mandates. Is that correct as part of the label?
That's right. It's all advisory. It's kind of like what I used to tell beekeepers. This is like telling your daughter to be good at school today. Be a good kid. Be nice. The enforceable label statements are like telling your son, do not throw a dirt clod or a rock at your sister. Like I say, it's completely advisory. Just tells them things they need to be on the watch out for and offers suggestions on how to reduce the exposure. The use directions are command statements or enforceable statements. If I'll go back real quick, we notice on this advisory box, it talks about reporting the bee kills to NPIC, which is a website hosted by Oregon State or by EPA. We'll have a slide later on here where if you do have a bee kill in North Carolina, we would like for you to call North Carolina Department of Ag and Consumer Services, whether it's with Don Hopkins and his bunch at the plant industry. I know we do have folks on from South Carolina. You could call the Clemson Department of Pesticide Regulation there in South Carolina for that. Or you can call the pesticide section here. We work closely with Don Hopkins' group on bee kills. He will look more at the bees and diseases and pests of the hive, where we'll take samples of pollen, the bees, the wax, to see if there are any residues in those areas. And we also look at all the label statements that the grower has on their product. But we are working very well close together on these investigations. We've had 3 this year, more in non-ag settings. They're in towns where there's not been much pesticide application going on. And we are seeing some high levels of varroa mite in those hives, and Don, I believe, says they're seeing a higher incidence of some of the diseases in those hives.
Yeah, just so you know, Pat, that our lab runs the viruses upon request of Don if they suspect any of the pathogens that can only be detected using molecular techniques. Right. And David's group has helped us with the analysis of couple of these from these hives as well. This is now the old label language that was proposed in 2013. You have different scenarios. You have crops under contact pollination services, those crops that are attractive to pollinators, and you have non-ag settings. This is the crops under contract pollination services. You heard a lot the other week about EPA's new program to reduce the exposure of bees. And if you listen to those or read those in detail, it talks about the contract pollinator hives, or those brought into the site for pollination services. Most of the changes that took place the other week deal solely with this group here, and that is our contract pollinators. So with this slide, I just marked through the old verbiage, and this slide now shows the new verbiage that came out at the end of May. It is for foliar applications, and this next few slides are for the neonicotinoid products, but it is for the foliar application of those. 2 sites with bees on site for commercial pollination services. This is not the hobbyist hives or hives on a farm, just to collect nectar. These are there for the purpose of pollination. And EPA sees this as a step forward because the contract pollination bees, they're the closest to the sites being treated with pesticides,
and they're the ones most likely to be exposed, whether they're on almonds that Wayne talked about earlier or in the blueberry fields. But the old slide mentioned that you could give the beekeeper a 48-hour notice before the spray occurred. The new label language took that notice off. It is now gone. So the label now says, foliar application of this product is prohibited from onset of flowering until flowering is complete, when bees are on site under contract. Okay? The only exemption for this is a government-declared public health response. Like in the southeast, if we have a hurricane, if we have to spray for mosquitoes, that would be the only example of a government-declared public health response. So that's the only exception to this label statement. It also says if there are other restrictive label language or more restrictive label language on these products, then that must be adhered to. That's where you get into a lot of the drift to the ground cover or to other flowers in the area, where you can't spray and allow that to drift onto those sites. With the old label language, we did have concerns that for hobby beekeepers, the contractor may know of the application and he could cover up his hives and move his hives out, for that application. But this does do away with that notice. So this is more protective of our other managed hives in the areas, whether they're hobbyists or other commercial beekeepers in the area, because no application will take place from the onset of bloom until the flowering is complete. One good thing about the contract pollinators is they are very well aware of what's going on their farm. They are in good communication with the grower and what he's applying to their crops. And they've already talked about, as Wayne said earlier, about the communication about the pesticides that would be used on the farm. The other scenario with the food crops and commercially grown ornamentals, this label language did not change the other week with EPA's release document. Still has the same paragraph about do not apply while bees are foraging, about the flowering is complete, all petals are falling off, you can't make the applications. But with this group, you do have a few exemptions that would allow the application. It could be made after sunset, like the slide that Wayne talked about. It could be made if the temperature is below 55 degrees. Of course, this doesn't apply too much in the growing season down south. Most of our growing season is above the 55 degrees. It does have the accordance with the government-initiated public health response there as well. We'll talk about this a little later on, about it could be made in accordance with the state apiary registration notification. We'll talk about North Carolina's. Just in short, now it does allow for a notice of 10 days down to 24 hours, but this calls for a 48-hour notice to the beekeepers, and we will be changing that regulation. The other scenario that will allow the use of the product if it's made for an imminent threat to the crop. If the grower is going to suffer significant crop loss, he has a documented IPM threshold or standard that needs to be met, then he could spray the crop. The other scenario is just the non-ag applications, whether it's made to landscape, ornamentals, or to like the side of houses for pest control. You can't apply the product while bees are foraging, and you cannot apply it to plants that are flowering. This also includes any kind of drift to flowers. You can't spray like the eaves of the house and let the pesticide product drift to other flowers in the yard where bees may be foraging. The other addition that EPA made the other week in their announcement is this statement that was on the neonicotinoids for contract pollination services. It will be added to 76 active ingredients that have been classified as acutely toxic to bees, or if their lethal dose is less than 11 micrograms per bee. We were talking about some of the tables in the Ag Chemical Manual this week. This does include the products in the Ag Chemical Manual that were highly toxic and moderately toxic to bees. EPA has kind of reclassified them now as acutely toxic to bees. We had the question earlier about the RT25 value. Everybody is very familiar with the LD50 being the amount of a chemical or a poison that would kill half of the population. The RT25 value is the residual toxicity of the amount of residues left that would be in contact with the bloom and the amount of time that that level would be high enough to kill 25% of the bees. So we do have to see that on labels more coming up, and it'll be a good idea for growers to look at that and better help them to make decisions on what products to apply. Like the scenario with 55 degrees. If the RT25 value was 12 hours or less, they could spray late in the evening. By early morning, the RT25 value would be low enough that it would not cause any adverse effect to bees after that 12-hour period. So it would be great to have this publicized more for growers to see those values. Most everyone is familiar with the presidential memorandum that came out in 2014, which stressed to USDA and EPA to do more to protect pollinators. There's a lot of approaches to this. We've talked a lot in the other meetings that I've done about the research that needs to be done. There's a lot of education and outreach that should be done to growers, beekeepers, and the general public. And the USDA has been charged with improving and increasing pollinator habitat. NCBA is doing this on research stations, planting more cover crops, and hopefully we'll have those seeds available to beekeepers if they want to plant small forage plots. Also with this, there was a charge to state and tribes as well to develop a pollinator protection plan in the states. We do have a pollinator task force in North Carolina. It's headed by North Carolina Farm Bureau with Debbie Hambrick. David and Wayne serve on this, as well as some IPN specialists from NC State. NCBA is represented through pesticides and also through the plant industry group. We have other commodity groups. Several beekeepers have been involved in this process, as well as some reps from the ag chemical industry. We're looking at some of the plans done by other states. They're using flags or as a designation of a pollination awareness zone or pollinator awareness zone that bees are in the area, and also mapping to do the same thing to allow for a website that you could go to and see pollinators in your area that would be near the farm so you want to use pesticides. We'll kind of catch up a little bit on what we're looking at in North Carolina for this. The main purpose, as Wayne said in his, is just to get growers and beekeepers to communicate with one another. Share your concerns, what the grower needs to do for his crop and what the beekeeper would need for their bees to flourish near his farm. But we talk a lot in our meetings that we do at the county level, whether this is a mandated rule or law or not, the success of the program lies with the growers and the beekeepers, because they were the ones that make it work. They would be the ones that need to talk with each other, share the concerns. The beekeepers need to let the farmers know where their hives are located, the apiaries are located, so the farmer does know if his applications would be within a certain distance of those apiaries. The state plan, I'll kind of go through this fairly quickly. Y'all can read the slides. The state plans are for managed pollinators. EPA is letting the pollination protection plans work with the managed pollinators. They try to address the contact pollinators on the labels, and they think they have done that. But they're going to let the states address the rest of the managed pollinators. These do include the honeybees, the leaf cutters, and mason bees, And we're on some calls today with Extension and about the use of bumblebees as well for pollination. Like I said, we sent out an email this spring on, for an invitation to come talk to counties, and this is great that we can talk to 4 or 5 counties at one time. I'll be in Craven County tomorrow night talking about this same thing. But this plan does define a pollinator awareness zone, whether it's through a flag or through a website, that it is a forage area for the bees. We talk a lot about how the growers and applicators can communicate with one another and identify where the apiaries are. The plan will also talk a lot about best management practices and how to minimize the risk of pesticide exposure to your bees. We are going to get a lot of outreach for this. Like I said, I been to the state bee meeting. I'll be up there again in July, as well as someone from EPA will be there to explain their side of the plan. There will be a lot of outreach in the coming years on this to growers. Most of these slides are in the private applicator recertification program that we're doing for this 3-year term. They're seeing the same slides that you are on the plan, the communication, the best management practices, and these label restrictions. A little bit about what's on the radar, what we're looking at. Keep your eyes and ears open for discussions on pollinator health as they happen. We will be revising our registered apiary program. As it is now, it is for only aerial application. It is not for ground application. It is for notification of aerial application of pesticides that are labeled as toxic to bees. Another concern about that is it's only a half-mile notification area. The pesticide board will be looking at that. We may extend it to a 1 mile. We will change the notification period to 24 hours instead of 48. No, I'm sorry, to 48 instead of 24. If you have a computer, of course you do if you're on this call, you can go ahead and Google some of the other state pollination protection plans, whether in Mississippi, North Dakota, or Florida, and see what they have done already. The Mississippi program came out a few years ago. They use a bee flag, which is about 14 by 20 or so. It's like a golf tee, golf hole flag. It comes on an 8-foot pole to show that there are bees in the area. We have talked about this in North Carolina. We would like for it to be maybe a little bigger. We think if we do have a couple years of outreach to applicators, they could become aware of the flag, and it could be a valuable tool to use as far as the pollination awareness of. David, do you want to do a poll to see if people think it would be a sufficient means of identifying the zone? Or do you
Certainly, yeah, that's a great idea. People can see that that picture there. Let's go ahead and use again that yes or no vote, and just kind of say if you think that a flag that designates an apiary, especially for aerial applicators, but just in general, whether you think that's going to be effective, and whether that would be a good aspect to the North Carolina plan as it develops and gets implemented. So the yes or no, under the participants window at the top, underneath your name. Okay. And it's about evenly split there, Pat. That's the poll as it stands right now. About 50-50.
Okay. And we have been doing surveys at these meetings and with the online survey that we'll show later. And it's about a third thinks this may be a sufficient means, 2/3 thinks not. We think if it was a little bigger and with the proper outreach that it could be a useful tool. But we will keep the survey open until about mid-July. So we would suggest everybody to go there. I'll have a web page later on that shows you that site. Appreciate everybody's comments on that. We're also looking at a program called DriftWatch. The company is FieldWatch, but the software is DriftWatch, that would allow beekeepers and other sensitive crop growers to go in and register their sites on a map. Then you could click on these bees here, the little yellow icons, and it brings up the contact information for the beekeeper. DriftWatch is aware of some of the concerns of pollinators about giving out too much contact information or too much detailed description of where the apiaries are. This is what an applicator would see. If other beekeepers go into the site, they are restricted to the amount of information they can see. We've had a lot of beekeepers talk about concerns as far as hives being stolen or supers being stolen, and they're going to kind of restrict the information of beekeepers. But this is what the pesticide applicators would see. And you could email the beekeeper or call them, if you need to make a application in the area. Here's the link to our survey. You can still go to this site. There's a beekeeper survey, there's a grower survey, as well as other resources. There is a link on this site to Lane's IPM website that he showed earlier. And if I was in a live meeting, if you asked a question, I would give you a bee for free, but it's kind of hard to do that on the webinar. But there's our cute little bee that we'll have at the Lake Generosity Museum. We'll close the survey after the state beekeepers meeting in July. One thing we've been working on with the task force with the pollination protection plan is a brochure, which is about just what the beekeeper would need to know about the farmer. Know your farmer for beekeepers, and for farmers we have the alternate know your beekeeper. And it talks about the concerns with the farmer about IPM, decisions that he needs to make, and also the other talks about beekeepers and where to place your hive, where to place your hives around their farm, talking with the farmer to get notice, and just what y'all need to work out together. We hope to have these as well at the meeting in July. We've not have them finished up. Of course, we don't have anything about DriftWatch or about the flags yet. This is just general information that we've already put into publication. Here's the email for Wayne Bueller and David Tarpey and Debbie Herrick and myself. If you do have concerns and would like to offer any suggestions to us on this task force, we welcome any comments you have. If you have any questions, I think I'm done.
So Pat, here's one about plans for outreach to non-commercial users, the general public, and just homeowners regarding their pesticide use.
Right. Yeah, after the July meeting, and we'll make more determination on the pollination protection plan, we'll send out another invitation to the county chapters. We will be including this information in our outreach to private applicators that Wayne does the private recertification talks to and that we help out with, as well as the commercial applicators. We'll probably work with the master gardeners in the counties to get the information out more to the non-ag users of pesticides, and we'll also work with the landscape industry and the mosquito abatement industry as far as the mosquito spraying. So once we get this done, there will be a massive outreach to all the sectors.
I should also mention, Pat, that the label, the EPA labeling requirements are really trying to make it as visible and as obvious on the labels about pollination pollinator protection. So, hopefully, the non-commercial applicators need to be following the label just like anybody else would, and so hopefully that will resonate a lot more, for that. But I agree, it is going to take concerted effort, afterwards as well. So there's some other questions here about the potential drift watch type of application. Are hobbyists allowed to register their apiary sites, or is it just commercial beekeepers? I'm pretty sure it's just anyone. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, anyone can register. We hope if we go with Driftwatch that you can order the flags while you're on their site. If you want a flag for your apiary, but it is all hives, any managed hive, whether it's a commercial beekeeper or a hobby beekeeper.
I should note that North Carolina has had a voluntary apiary registration program that hasn't been mandatory. And what was the last count, Pat? Was it 12 beekeepers statewide have actually registered their apiary locations? Something, given that we have 15,000 estimated beekeepers in the state, it's something, pretty low.
Yeah, we had 17 last year. I think we're maybe up to about 18 this year.
Yeah.
But I think you can say it is just for aerial application. Of course, in the Piedmont Mountains, we don't have that much of the aerial application taking place up there, so the numbers are low.
Yeah, so I think the numbers are lower, but I think this is also, that there's going to probably be a sea change when it comes to a little more active citizenry among the beekeeping community to be, to be engaged in that conversation and literally getting on the radar a little bit easier to help potentially mitigate some of these incidents, or at least try to avoid them. So here's a question on the chat board. Do commercial pesticide applicators see this favorably, or is it seen more as kind of more and more regulation from governmental entities? I think that's a very insightful question. And I know that in my conversations, it's been mixed. In some cases, it is seen as overbearing, and in others, kind of a welcomed change because it can help clarify some of the ambiguities. How would you address that, Pat?
We have talked with the Aerial Application Association. They're very open to this and the pollination protection plan. We have talked to commercial applicators. Some of them do have concerns about some of the restrictions, especially, as I talked going through about the 55 degrees and the sunset. It's hard to spray thousands of acres, late evening. If you really need to apply pesticides to your crop, it's hard to do it in a few hours. The aerial applicators, of course, they're not going to fly at night. There's too many other dangerous things you can run into at night, like power lines. They're hard to see at night. But they're very open to the pollinator label language. And they're very aware of the discussion.
So speaking of that language, another question came up, and you made a distinction earlier in some of these that there was some of the language was just advisory, but there was other language that was not, that was kind of mandates and mandatory. Can you go back very quickly and and highlight the things that are just suggested versus the things that are imposed, just to make it clear of exactly what is by choice of the applicator versus those things that are not, because I think that's important here.
The first page that was showed in this black and orange, that is all the advisory label language. Like I said, it talked about, bees can be harmed by the residues, and just guidelines that the growers need to follow. The restrictive label language is this.
So this is what the applicator must follow, right?
Right. Application is prohibited from onset of flowering. You cannot apply it, period, during any flowering. For the food crop and other ornamentals, do not apply this product while bees are foraging. That is enforceable, labeling. Do not apply until flowering is complete and all petals have fallen off. Of course, you have the exceptions, but these are the very limited exceptions that they can legally apply the product. So it's after sunset, temperatures between 55 degrees, or if appliance with the state yesterday berry program or not the end standard. The non-ag side, do not apply. The name of the product while bees are foraging. Do not apply is enforceable. Do not apply this product to plants that are flowering. They're very enforceable statements.
Okay. I just want to make that clear so that there wasn't an impression that all of this was just wishing for the best and just advisory, but not actually enforceable from the regulatory side. But clearly that is, and it helps clarify some of the ambiguities that the previous label has. So.
And the other question was about oxalic acid. It has now been registered in North Carolina for use. So that product is available.
And that's probably another webinar or another presentation about implementing this new tool for the roll-up control and IPM strategies. And so that's something that is I think a little more specific to beekeepers, not the general issue of pesticide labeling and the things that bees could be coming into contact both inside the hive and outside. So if there's no other questions, I just want to thank our hosts again, the Johnson County Beekeepers, for allowing this presentation. We actually were scheduled to talk about something else this month, but because of the timeliness and Wayne and Pat's willingness and availability and their just excellent expertise about this issue, we really thought that this was going to be much more appropriate, and hopefully got a lot out of this. So thank you again to the Johnson County Beekeepers, and save the date for the next webinar. The topic has not yet been decided, but our virtual hosts will be the Surrey County Beekeepers, and we appreciate their willingness and availability to do that. So thank you again, everybody. A big round of applause for Dr. Bueller and Pat, and thanks again for being here tonight.